Welcome to the RAD Plan, or suggesting a prioritized, operationalized list of performance metrics with the goal of creating a regional, actionable data dashboard. My name is Thaddaeus Gassie, and I work at Crisis Response Network. I'm with their HMIS team, which stands for Homeless Management Information System. We help support individual nonprofits as they, in turn, are providing all kinds of services to persons experiencing homelessness. What I do day to day is a cross between software support, help desk support, training, crunching numbers, interpreting federal guidelines, and trust me, it's like a whole other language. And finally, a lot of other fun projects based around the HMIS team mission, which is to drive and inspire data-informed change so that we can improve homeless systems. So what is this RAD plan is what you're probably thinking right now. So here is how we're going to go over it. I'll start by briefly reviewing some of the problems that our region faces when it comes to addressing homelessness, but I will also take the time to explain a bit about the context of the so-called homeless system. Then I'll take you through some of the questions that come to mind considering the problems I've brought up. Then I'd like to go straight into my hypothesis. I will then give you an idea of what research I'm looking to do, and I'll mention any tools that'll be necessary. Very important, the next part is the deliverables, what I hope to give to you and to the community. The so what section is going to give more explanation of how my proposed research and deliverables will improve the capacity for resilience for the communities involved in the scope of my project. And I hope to also make it to my acknowledgements, but I promise you by the end of the project, my acknowledgements section will end up being enormous because there's going to be a lot of people to connect in the coming months. And Dr. Solis, please keep me on the ball for this one. Just in case I go too slow, there will be time for your questions and feedback at the very end also. My eyes are on the system and how it responds to homelessness. You see, when it comes to addressing homelessness, it's best for entire regions to coordinate together, to work together and put forth coordinated effort. So the entity, the community whose resilience I'm concerned about is that very system itself. And I'll be illustrating that as we go on more about this entity. My problem then is a lack of resilience in our response to homelessness. The Maricopa Continuum of Care's homeless response remains unable to handle the scale of homelessness, leaving thousands on the street and unattached to available services. And furthermore, when this scale changes due to unexpected and impactful events like COVID-19, the Continuum's homeless response, lack of resilience, makes it difficult for them to adjust. Now, I want to illustrate who makes up the continuum of care in Maricopa. What you're seeing on the screen is a basic rendition of the parties, the entities who make up the Maricopa Continuum of Care. The continuum is directed by the COC board at the top. The services and shelters, the hotel vouchers, and outreach teams, those are the entities who directly interact with the persons experiencing homelessness, right? They're the entity with red circles. The red circle entities, by the way, are the ones that enter service data into HMIS. I am a member of the HMIS lead team. We are in the top left corner where it says HMIS lead Maricopa. We train and support the red circles in their use of HMIS and help interpret the findings and reports that come out of all the data to every square in the continuum of care. So when I say the continuum struggles to adjust to the scale of homelessness, especially when it changes to things like COVID-19 curveballs, I'm talking about this cluster, this whole left cluster. I could spend hours talking about what the cluster does and what it does well, but well isn't perfect. And frankly, I'd like to be closer to perfect any day because you see those red circles, they're helping human beings survive. And when the continuum works better, we help those human beings better. So here were my RAD questions. Where and why are there bottlenecks in our COC homeless response process? Where and why are there bottlenecks in our COC decision-making process? What is the proper way to actually influence the COC to act on data-informed changes where data moves beyond inspiring and begins to actualize change? Who are the COC's actors of interest and what limits their agency to act? And that could be limits in their power or authority or other limits. I have even more questions. What metrics should be known by all actors of interest in order to act in a more coordinated way? When actors of interest review performance metrics, and it shows problems like gaps or slows or deficiencies, what are the corresponding actionable levers that should be moved in order to address those problems? What are the action levers in our system we can push up and down, which will improve the metrics? What are the flags that tell actors of interest to know to act on a metric? This is my hypothesis. And there's a little quote at the top: a goal without a plan is just a wish. So on the left, if the Maricopa region's continuum of care can agree to a regional actionable data dashboard, that's the RAD acronym, it would help improve the degree of consistent, coordinated response to homelessness-related issues. This is because while the data available through the regional HMIS is actionable already, the process of systematically discussing and/or reviewing actionable responses to the data does not currently exist. In other words, we don't have a plan of action to respond in X or Y ways when we see X or Y data. So this is going to take a whole lot of research. And to prove that point, I need to take a drink of water because my mouth is already drying out. Okay, so first of all, we need to identify bottlenecks and gaps. That would look like interviewing and assessing stakeholders, and that includes persons and organizations, and also funders. We need to identify the actors of interest. Who are the people who have the powers to make things happen? We need to identify the performance metrics, which should be known by the actors of interest in order to react in a coordinated fashion. Now, on the national scale or even the global scale, there are best practices. There's lots of research and federal expectations that can be looked into, but also I want to do it regionally, creating assessments and surveys to find out from everyone from the face-to-face people that interact with clients directly to their managers and directors, and all the way up that cluster of the continuum of care, assessing them and asking them, what kind of metrics do you think or do you know would be helpful? And aggregating and comparing the best practices with the regional preferences. Even more research, identifying actionable levers that correspond with each of the performance metrics. So it's the same thing, national and regional, look at the best practices, look at what people are saying, what people are knowing, and then checking with what's currently happening and what they would want it to look like. Also identifying the flags to correspond with each of the performance metrics. In other words, when do you know that action should be pursued? Is it at 49% or at 50% of this particular metric that we take action? And then prioritizing these levers. Like what if there's a competing urgencies? How do we know which ones are the ones to spend resources on? And the same approach, looking at best practices, national level of lit review and federal guidelines, and then regional interviews and checking in with organizations and funders and things like that. One of the things that is, I can already tell you from experience, is when you get into a room and there's a lot of different entities there, there's agencies, there's committees, there's funders, there's coalition groups, you will find that you have to like redefine the language itself to understand what it is you're talking about. And so the idea of connecting what everyone thinks they need with whatever the best practices might say is going to be a very important step in this process. So one of the tools definitely that's going to need to be done, and there might be others in the future, is to create an assessment, surveys meant to be distributed regionally. And the questions would include these among other sorts of things. So to gather information about the metrics, for you or your agency, what data helps you to know your performance? And then for levers, what actions do you take to improve these findings? And flags, at what point do you know that action should be taken, or when should action be taken? And the priority, how would you prioritize each of your personal agency metrics? In the end, the intent is to deliver at least two things, or at least two kinds of things: a white paper or some other kind of publication that's showing, here's the process that we did, here is how it impacted us, here's what the community did with the findings, and then actually presenting the regional actionable data dashboard which has embedded a suggested list of action levers, a suggested list of flags, and a suggested list of priorities. This is meant to be a tool that is used by the continuum of care and something that is seen by external entities too, at least in part, so that there can be accountability to, are they holding to the stuff that they said they would do? So let's talk a little bit about what this means. Like, what does this provide for us? Let's talk about cohesion first. So individuals do better in a disaster if they have stronger personal networks. Similarly, the continuum can be understood as a group of entities that work together to navigate the shifting field that is homelessness and how it can be very impactful by disaster itself. For example, pandemic and social distancing changes. The continuum is a network with a single goal: to solve homelessness as a region. This network is comprised of parties who gather information, parties who report findings and data, parties who convene and can make decisions, parties with the authority to change and shift the way that the players work with each other to end homelessness. So the actionable data feedback plan, or the RAD plan, would be a tool to increase the cohesion of the continuum while providing additional dividends at the same time. Let's talk about some of those dividends now. First of all, speed. Having agreed upon metrics and actionable levers and flags could help speed continuum response so important actions aren't slowed by overly bureaucratic decision-making processes. Also, in the research portions where we go over looking for gaps and slows and those sorts of things, that's going to give us a better idea of learning as we go along. How can this sort of approach improve? Next is accountability. With a plan comes increased accountability, as entities both inside and outside the continuum can see to an extent how well the continuum is able to meet its own goals. And then, as I mentioned earlier, unified language. The language and descriptions used to describe efforts in homelessness service provision aren't always the same, causing a stumbling block for understanding what's happening, and also importantly, creating hazards when communicating to external entities like the public, to the media, and to elected officials. Having actionable metrics creates an opportunity for focusing attention on consistent, agreed upon language, defining the extent of homelessness and what's being done to address it in our region using that agreed upon language. Oh, lost my mouse. Hope it didn't lose its battery. Found it. All right, so at this point, I know that I can acknowledge a lot of people on our team and pretty much everyone from the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience, because in greater and smaller ways, I've had a lot of bits and pieces from everyone there. And I've got a lot of minds I have yet to tap. I have a lot of questions right now still for the research board. And I've already got a lot of people lined up to be discussing things with, like, Arizona Department of Housing, Access, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. They have enormous bodies of information about ways to do this, and so many more, because there are a number of communities that have versions and variations of this idea. So lots and lots of conversations and lots of hours are going to be spent gathering a lot of information and moving towards a plan. I realized now that there's a slide that I really wanted to add that I didn't add, which is a concerns slide. During this process of suggesting best practices to an enormous continuum, there's going to be a lot of navigating the different interests. So there might be political interests or personal agency interests or hesitations or fears, and all that kind of stuff is going to have to be navigated during this process. So I'm aware, and I'm going to have to keep on whatever team is doing all the interviews, concerns about framing the decisions and concerns about blame. Like, we don't want to point out, like, this is the slow person, this is the bad entity or whatever. The point of this is not to say who needs to be fired. The point of this is to say, how can we strengthen this process as a whole? What would work for us? What do we want to do, looking at what could be done? And how can we hold ourselves accountable to it? So that concludes my presentation so far. If you want, and if there's time, I can also show a little bit about this, of what do metrics look like? What can they look like? Just let me know if that's something you're interested in. And thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel like applauding. Thanks. I do
That was
too.
a great, you have such a really great presentation style. I really enjoyed it. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I know there's going to be. So let's get that going, guys. While we're crowdsourcing a couple questions, why don't you go to that metrics thing and speak
I'd
just a
love to.
moment about it, because I think that that level of detail is a really good thing to see.
Sure thing. I mean, I used a lot of words here and I didn't take much time to describe them or define them. Metrics is one of them, performance metrics. It's how do you measure good things that you do? So on this chart, you're gonna see on the left, these are the metrics basically. Entries with no prior homelessness, retention of permanent housing, returns to homelessness, length of time on wait list. Those are the sort of things you see in that first column. In the middle column, you see acronyms like HP, SSO, SO. Those are acronyms denoting the types of agencies, the types of programs that are the red circles from the continuum of care, the ones who actually interface directly with clients. SSO is supportive services only projects. SO is street outreach. ES is emergency shelter. RRH is rapid rehousing. And each of the X's in those areas are saying this kind of metric is actually very important to this kind of project. And then on the far right, there's a calculation of what's a way that we could have a measure for this particular one. Like for instance, length of time on wait list, that's a wait list to enter housing. And the measure would be the average time from the first time the client was assessed to the day that they were referred to a program. And that average would be the calculation. So if the average was 20 days, we could say the flag is 25 days. And if the average rises above 25, then we have to take this specific actionable thing to resolve that in our region. But yeah,
Michael has a great question here. Go ahead, Michael.
I can read it, or he can.
Yeah, I'm struggling to unmute. I'm sorry.
Oh.
So yeah, my question was about, so I love this. I'm really interested in what you've learned about when a technology or an app is appropriate, or when a change in the organizational practices can happen without an app. This seems to be like one of the most difficult problems that folks can encounter. I wonder what your experience has been with it so far.
I have less experience and more stories from like people on my team and people in other committees who sometimes they'll be in the committee and there's a suggestion, and just like any kind of group or meeting, sometimes action doesn't necessarily happen, and it can be because of organizational revision. And I think that sometimes organizational revision, rather than relying on people to do a thing, I think it's good to have a plan and agree to a plan and then be held accountable to the plan. And that's kind of what this is stamping down, we already have what the data is. Let's agree on the metrics and the actions to take when we hit certain flags with those metrics. And therefore there's an accountability where regardless of what the organization is, they see that this thing has to happen and that certain steps have to be taken. So it's kind of going around the organizational revision by saying, like, can we agree to this rule? And it's going to be very interesting to see what everyone from the COC board down to the agencies, when they're like, yeah, you've been working on this a while, what do you have? And I'm going to show it to them all, and they're all going to know what everyone said, because I'm going to tell them, I'm going to say, sorry guys, the dashboard didn't pass because these entities didn't like it for these reasons. And I find to myself, that level of accountability is I want that to happen. I want people to know why things don't get agreed on too. So if it fails, I'll still be happy.
Melanie has a related question to that.
Have you encountered reluctance by organizations and partners to capture, document, and publicize these kinds of metrics out of fear? Oh, of course. And it depends on the types of metrics too. The thing about knowing about what you're doing, it's all about framing what's going on. Like if we're gonna have, and that's why I said like some of this might be public, some of it might be private to certain entities in the continuum of care. sometimes there's no way to frame something that looks bad, and there's just a huge chance that someone's going to take it and run with it in the wrong direction. But there's a lot of other metrics that you can, they can be taken bad. So if you're going to be the presenter of that metric, if you are going to be the dashboard, if you are going to be the interpreter of the data, it's your job to correctly frame it in the positive way instead of turning it into like a shame fest.